Welcome to the Vienna Humanities Festival. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the organizers of the festival, and especially Desi Gavrilova for her kind invitation to moderate this panel. My name is Adam Schatz, and I'm a writer at the London Review of Books. The title of this panel, The Sleepwalkers, is an allusion both to the great novel of the Austrian writer Hermann Broch and to Christopher Caldwell's masterly history of the First World War. And the question raised by the title is, are the United States and Europe sleepwalking into a wider war in Ukraine with potentially devastating consequences, not just for the people of Ukraine, but for the world? It was 8 months ago that Vladimir Putin launched his invasion, and it has provoked an extraordinary resistance and national renaissance among Ukrainians. At the same time, in response, Vladimir Putin has doubled down, affirming in his latest and rather bellicose speech his determination to fight to the end against the forces of Western Satanism, and indicating a willingness even to use nuclear weapons if the West continues to oppose him. Now, the Ukrainians, of course, have no choice but to press on with what is for them an existential battle. But where does that leave Europe and the United States? Should they continue to supply the Ukrainians with weapons and intelligence and impose sanctions on Russia? Or should they engage in direct talks in the hope of reaching a peace settlement, even if such a settlement might leave parts of Ukraine under Russian control? Our speakers today are well poised to reflect on these questions. Christopher Caldwell is a contributing editor at the Claremont Review of Books and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. He's the author most recently of The Age of Entitlement, America Since the 1960s, published by Simon & Schuster in 2020. NATALIYA GUMENYUK is a well-known Ukrainian journalist based in Kyiv whose work has appeared in The Guardian and The Atlantic Monthly. She's the author of 3 books and the founder of the Public Interest Journalism Lab. Natalia, I'd like to start with you, since you've been reporting from the ground in Kyiv. In a recent column in The Guardian, you wrote that when Putin announced his intention to send 300,000 more troops to Ukraine, Ukrainians felt a sense of relief and even hope. Why is that?
So if we want to start from that, so first of all, that's an honor to speak to you now. Of course, Ukrainians still believe that a lot depends on the Russian population. Somehow, I think the Ukrainians are the people who are the biggest Russophiles because they still hope for the good in the Russians. That's one thing. There is still, because I think it's a bit of a defense trait. So there is still the hope that the regime in Russia could be at least not so monolith. And we know that this recent mobilization, so far the Russian regime was trying to play this war as a TV war. You know, as if there was a pact existing in Russia for the last decades with oil money, with all the industry that stay home, don't do politics, and we won't come to you, but let us do wherever we want. Steal, you know, be corrupt, put our political opponent in prison, invade other countries, Georgia, Syria, wherever, but just, we don't touch you. And even despite all this horrendous propaganda, the call to exterminate Ukrainians, which is existing in the Russian television, we still, it was still not in the Russian households. And now I think that it's the first time when the Russians felt the war. For the Russians, the war started now. So, and I do think as well, as somebody who lives through the war with all its perils, that in particular in Russia, where the country is huge and try to control everything, which is impossible, the situation might spin out of the control. So the people who, because it's not about the protest, these not so many protests were there of the people who went to the streets, but about those indifferent people who should be not indifferent any longer, that they might question. And then the Russian government would need to deal also with this in a problem instead of just being focused on the invasion.
So the hope is to sow division among the Russian public and appeal to the better, more humane side of Russians. But are you concerned at all that the sanctions might have the reverse effect? Because historically, sanctions tend to unify populations rather than to divide them.
I do think that there is a different types of sanctions we're speaking in case of Russia, because before the 24th of February, we were speaking mainly about, really this pressure to the people that they do something. And I think this mobilization and the sanctions are totally two separate things. They are not connected directly. The call for the sanctions in case of Ukraine are very clear. It's really to stop financing Russian war machine, which has a very real practical implementations for the Ukrainians, practical impact. One bomb, which was, shot 2 days ago, killed 23 people who wanted to evacuate near Zaporizhia. So every single bomb is a life lost. Every single shot, or like the Russian tank, or the opportunity to deliver things, they have a direct impact on the particular human lives. So for Ukrainians, the call for the sanctions is not any longer to pressure. It's not really shouldn't be compared to the Iranian experience or the experience of Cuba, but really stop the war machine to extent it's possible. At least they, have less fuel, have less logistic, have less of this, maybe don't have such a sophisticated weapon, or at least know that they won't have, enough money to pay.
And I imagine that Putin's declaration that he would send 300,000 more troops was also heartening, because it was an indication that the Ukrainian resistance is working on some level.
Yes, I do. Of course, there was quite a humiliating defeat, but honestly, I care less about that as a Ukrainian citizen, as a journalist, as a pacifist, which I would call myself still, despite of everything. Because for us, every liberated village is 50 or 100 saved lives. Just like Monday, I was in Izum in the town where there was one mass grave found. There were 2 more at the day I was there found. And I met the people who were freed from the torture chambers by the Ukrainian troops. If they didn't enter, those people were killed. So Ukrainians still consider everything which is going on in terms of the momentum, understanding that there might be a limit, but every day might save particular amount of lives, because wherever we go, and within the other project, I'm documenting war crimes, alleged crimes against humanity. And we see that the longer was the occupation, the more cases of murder were. In almost every single town and village, there was a case of execution. In any larger town in Kharkiv region, there was a torture chamber. So it's super practical. It's not about bravado. It's not about, national renaissance or things like that. You capture the city, you free people from prisons, you let them leave, you let them be evacuated, because also the policy of the Russian troops for the last months were not letting people out. They were fighting this war where they keep in the whole towns and villages as hostages. So there was no green corridors, there was no organized evacuation rather than to Russia. So it's where the Ukrainians' thoughts are. And we understand there might be a moment there would be the reinforcement of the Russian troops, but we also understand, again, to be more precise, I'm coming from the human rights background. I'm not a war strategist, but need to become partially one. The Russians are not fighting very efficiently. So within the last months, they didn't capture many towns. They just
lost another one. One of the annexed towns they just lost.
Absolutely.
Chris, you've been since the war began, even before, a very articulate critic of American policy on Ukraine. Can you elaborate on the reasons for your criticisms of the Biden administration's posture vis-a-vis Ukraine, and why you don't see this war as being in the American national interest?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to say I'm honored to be here, and thank you very much. I think, Adam, you did me a little too much honor in your introduction when you gave me credit for authoring the great history of World War I, which is by Christopher Clark. But thank you all the same. The thing that I've tried to do throughout the war is to maybe complexify the American position a bit, and to sort of change the way that we look at it. I think that most nations have not just Russia and Ukraine, but also the United States, have an interest in avoiding war, and I'd like to sort of examine a little more closely how we get to this point. I think in the United States, where the level of historical knowledge about the Black Sea and about the whole post-Soviet space in general is neither very deep nor very widespread, we have a tendency to view this war in purely moral terms. It's good guys against bad guys. Which side do you want to be on? Unfortunately, we've committed a tremendous amount of firepower to what turns out to be, a highly complex strategic situation. Obviously, Natalia is from the region, and I'd welcome her view on this. But, on the one hand, we have, for a very long time, underestimated Ukrainian nationalist feeling, for a very long time. I mean, in the 1960s, there were waves of Ukrainian protests that were the equal of the Hungarian, German, and Polish protests in the decade before, and the Czech protests later in the decade. Most people, even area experts, know nothing about them. I think, and then there is the question of why the Ukrainian situation was not resolved in the wake of the Cold War. And if you'll forgive me for speculating, I think that a lot of it is about Crimea. This might be the prejudice of one who's read a little bit about the Crimean War, but it's other people have said the Crimea is a defensive super asset. It permits a country to project power throughout the Black Sea and into several different civilizations at once. Crimea is a military strategic prize, and it has been for a quarter of a millennium, the key to the south of the Russian Empire. On top of that, Crimea was a very difficult part of the Ukrainian problem to solve, and you've had, Crimeans voting for autonomy from Ukraine. I'm not referring to 2014, but to 1991 and 1994. So they themselves have had their aspirations thwarted in a way. And I think the reason, if you have to ask yourself why, if you look at, you have to ask yourself why didn't we solve the Ukraine problem in the 1990s? At a time when eventually we even came up with some kind of a solution to the Yugoslav problem. I think the reason we didn't solve it is because it far from being an easy problem, it was a very hard problem. And so to sum up, I'd say it seems like a problem in which the United States, far away and lacking a good knowledge base, in which the United States should interpose itself with the greatest of caution.
What would the greatest of caution have looked like after February 24th?
That is a very interesting and fair question, which sort of splits our consciousness in a Gramscian way of what into a question of what the situation means and what we ought now to do. As for what we ought now to do, I do not know that I can suggest a good alternative strategy from this point forward, other than to say, other than to warn that there's not any stopping point in the American strategy. There's not a logical stopping point for it. It involves moving ahead to take everything that Ukraine held before 2014. I think that's an unstable position. On the other hand, if you don't get to that position, you're just prolonging a really bloody war. So I think that that's the difficulty, is sort of like finding a way to stop this, I think, or a place to stop it on which there's no consensus on either side.
Let me probably answer, and I will definitely return to the topic of the discussion and the name. I was a bit, first of all, I probably need to clarify the Crimea, because in 1991, there was the attempt to restore the destroyed in 1943 Crimean Tatar autonomy. And there was a vote, but it was misused by the communists to create this kind of pro-Russian enclave inside of Ukraine. But that's one thing. But I was a bit puzzled from the very beginning with the title of the talk about the sleepwalking into the war. And the more I thought about that, the more I agree, because I do agree that the US and the West sleepwalked to this war by its inaction for many, many years. And in particular, in case of Russia and Putin, this inaction is a provocation that you have the right to invade. When I was talking in 2016, because you started with Crimea, to General Hodges, Ben Hodges, who was a commander of the NATO allied troops in Europe, he was, I think, right after the retirement, I dared to ask, like, did you know on the day the Russians invaded Crimea in 2014, whether they were the Russian troops? And I remember the whole 2015, I spent time, and not just me, to persuade the West that there were Russians, that it was not like just some kind of people. And he said, like, yes, of course we knew. From the first day, and in Debaltsevo, we knew there were Russians, but of course we didn't want to get involved as a NATO. We didn't want. And I strongly, at that time also in March, I was in Crimea talking to the Ukrainian military, who was very kind of disappointed, saying like, we as a military, we should have answered. And I also said, like, you know, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe that was a good idea that we didn't provoke Russia for something more bloodier. And of course, after the years, seeing the Crimea becoming a stronghold for the Russian military attack, I understood that probably we were definitely wrong, and of course the President Obama at that time, and everybody who thought that it would be enough. Then it was the Donbass. And what also interesting, that of course were different governments and different, Ukraine is democracy, the changing political parties. But what is very interesting for historical record, and I do think it would stay in the historic record, Ukraine is run by the anti-militarists who went to the, who were voted on the platform of ending the war in the peaceful way. I personally was also coming on the human rights background, participating in all those discussions, which were candid in Cyprus, in Istanbul, with so-called people from DPR, with some Russians. And you know, the more I thought, then the more I thought that they were taking our time, because there was no ever any sincere attempt to really sort it out. And now even the people with whom, the Russians, with whom I was kind of debating in Istanbul after the war, when they saw me somewhere on CNN, they told me like, you're right, there is nothing which influences us rather than the Ukrainian troops, and the only thing that they are backing up, it's when the Ukrainian army is attacking. So I do think that also, just again, I think that there is one disappointment with the President Zelensky is not about making, also by the Biden administration, is not really that Ukraine is pushing too hard to get this equipment. But I think there are a lot of Americans who vice versa telling, why the President Zelensky dismissed the war so much? Because till the last second, he wanted to avoid this war. And it just, for historical record, would be so obvious that it unfortunately didn't work. So for me, the point that Ukraine received this weapon, which was done for the guerrilla war, not for the army, the javelins and the others, they are there for partisans, not really for the legit army to defend their cities. It could be different. Maybe those territories won't be invaded at that moment. So today, when I'm speaking about we have this discussion about the nuclear threat, and of course, for me, it's very close. Of course, I live in Kyiv. Most of my friends stayed. But I should say that I think it's also possible, because after the initial shock, when Putin didn't expect the Ukrainian army to be that strong, or his army to be defeated, he found that there are other loopholes. There is a way to persuade the West that they should drop support to Ukraine, and therefore he used this weakness to escalate. So if there is, because in the end game, you know, what we would get, a further escalation when anybody with a nuclear button can do whatever, and that's exactly what we want to stop, that there would be some rules which can stop the bigger war or something more horrible at the moment when it's still possible.
Would you like to reply?
About stopping a bigger war?
Yeah.
Well, that is my worry, is that it has now become a US-sized war, and the United States is a major combatant in the war. Not just a supplier, but a combatant. And I think that my worry is that under modern circumstances, let's say under information age, internet circumstances, a much larger proportion of the killing power of an army is in the technology rather than the people. You don't really, we fought a war 25 years ago in Serbia over Kosovo, where we didn't lose a single soldier, and yet it was our war, and we fought it. It had huge consequences. I think that Russia increasingly understands the United States as their enemy in this war, and not as the supplier. I think Russia increasingly understands this as a Russia-US war, and I think that that's an escalation and a potential destabilization.
In 2017, you described Putin as the preeminent statesman of our time, and as a hero to conservative populists throughout the globe, and said that he was for conservative populists what Castro once was for a leftist.
Yeah,
do you still hold to that judgment?
Well, certainly if you understand it as value-free, as a sort of an assessment of his importance rather than a fan letter. I think I put him there with
Erdogan.
Erdogan, that's right. And there are other people. There aren't many other candidates for that type of sort of, accolade. You would have, people like, Modi or, maybe Hugo Chavez in his time. I'm talking about people who really sort of like altered the course of something, as Putin really did in the year 2000. And I think there's no gainsaying his importance, whatever, one thinks about him as a role model.
Mm-hmm. But what's not clear to me is that why on February 24th, why did in your view, the United States and Europe not have an interest in preventing him from altering the course in Ukraine, which was an unprovoked aggression and an attempt to, I mean, it's led by this call that Ukraine is Russia.
Right. Well, they do have an interest in stopping it, and they did before February 24th. My argument is only that they're treating a complex situation as a simple situation.
But do you think that it is a mistake to supply Ukrainians with ammunition and intelligence? Are you saying that you're opposed to that and you view that as an act of an act that lacks prudence?
Well, one would need to distinguish between granting the right of a people to defend itself against aggression and wanting to avoid escalation. And the United States really has a special interest. It is the power that can determine the second of those questions. And I would say my answer to that would predominate. That is, I would choose non-intervention on the grounds of preventing escalation.
Natalia?
No, generally would think it's very, for me, weird to discuss whom today Vladimir Putin picks up as his enemy. Today it's NATO, tomorrow the US, third day the Ukrainians. The problem of the Kremlin is, of course, misunderstanding the agency of the Ukrainian people. They just fully don't understand why. And I do think that partially as well in the West, there is quite a lot of people who also do not understand the agency of the Ukrainians. And disregarding that would be especially when there are these discussions, with due respect, Christopher, when there are the discussion about like NATO war or something war, and we criticizing the US for involving and being imperialistic, exactly in this discussion, these authors often ignore the Ukrainians, and who are pretty solid in their position. The government, the democratically elected government, the functioning parliament, the opposition, the civil society. And if they tell the same things, maybe there is a time to listen. That's one point. But
Natalia, just one moment though, and I mean no disrespect to Ukrainian agency, but had it not been for the support of the West, Ukraine's resistance to the invasion would have been crushed by now.
No, that's absolutely, I would agree. It would be, how to say it won't be crushed. That would be more brutal and bloody. That is a difference. It won't be, probably would be more territories overtaken. There would be, we would look at Syria, that would be more similar like that. So still disregarding all the horrors, and I do have people, I know people who died, I know people who died in the battlefield, I know people who, who were killed by the airstrikes. It's still controlled because the Ukrainian army defend these people, the legit big Ukrainian army defend towns. Otherwise, this war would be bloody. On the weapon. Interesting enough, I think it's also often missed that we often discuss the President Zelensky, and I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and I think like we are grown up in the idea of the opposition to the government and the president. It feels very weird to support your president, to be honest, for me as well. But one trait is often missed in discussion of him, is that his core value are the protection of the human life. So everything which is done by Zelensky is usually done in order to save the people, citizens, or save the soldiers. So there is no this call to take this town whatsoever. We have this contrary to, great Second World War, that Ukrainian army might retreat and lose the territory, but the savior of the life is very important. That's why the whole call for the weapon today isn't particularly driven by the idea that this Western weapon is more precise and efficient It doesn't kill, it doesn't have such much collateral damage. We need to have these HIMARSs, in particular because it's possible to target the military depot, the warehouses of the weapon, or the logistical hub, and the Ukrainian citizens living in another towns won't be defeated. So there would be less civilian casualties. Because Russia, of course, makes huge damage to the Ukrainians, to the civilians, to the lives, but it's not very efficient. So really, the paradox, which, again, very hard for me to admit, that the Western weapon is less deadly and more efficient. So the whole call for this weapon is really for having, a more efficient way of waging the war. Otherwise, Ukraine need to fire these grads, which are devastating.
The war's gone on for 8 months, and there are no signs that it's about to stop. And at least in this most recent period, Ukraine's battle has, to some extent, rekindled liberal faith in the West. And although one could argue that enthusiasm about the Ukrainian struggle, as Christopher has argued, is confined to the latte-sipping liberal elites, I think, as you put it, there's still a tremendous amount of goodwill. Now, the great sacrifices of this war have been borne by Ukrainians, of course, and will continue to be. But there will be a cost. We've already seen a cost in the West, whether it's rising fuel prices or inflation and what have you. How, Natalia, will Ukrainians continue to persuade their benefactors in Europe and the United States that the Ukrainian cause is an important cause for them as well? Because the war has gone on quite some time. And the amount of goodwill that you see now may be chipped away to some extent. What's the case? What is the Ukrainian case to its supporters abroad?
The Ukrainian case is to show probably that there is a vision of the victory, and we can clearly say how it looks like, to regaining and liberating as much of the Ukrainian territory, point one, and the second, not have the rockets falling on the Ukrainian civilians' head, randomly, as it's happened today or a few days ago when the bombs are shelled on the civilian cities. That easy, to be honest. Yes, there could be the war of attrition, but I think the Ukrainians are pragmatic, and that's why they're rallying so much, because they want to make it shorter. Because if you're in this position, you understand that the longitude of the war is not in your favor. Thus, the idea is, because you don't want the Russia buy more time, so the idea is to liberate as much territory as possible, as fast as possible, to extent it's doable. Of course, there is the, let's say, historical, philosophical, wherever, political implication. Of course, this is a war of values. Of course, it shows that the basic rules shouldn't be broken. And in the previous discussion, we were talking about civilization, Western civilization. What is interesting, the most common word I've heard from the Ukrainians, whether they would be in the villages, maybe the workers, they think that they fight for civilization. Because for them, there is a very clear way, civilized. I talked to one mayor in a small town on close to the Russian border. He thinks that his town, it was devastated, but it was a frontier for the civilization where he thinks he needs to fight for the rule of law, that it is impossible by one power to throw the bombs on another country. So I do think still, if we're really in this very clear case, do not really stop this, then of course we already sleepwalked in the huge crisis in which neither UN, no Council of Europe, no OSCE, even NATO, none of them really looking absolutely efficient, and they need to be rethought. And of course, if the boundaries are tested by Vladimir Putin, they might be tested by the others, by, dictators in different parts of the world. So if we really think that we spend so many years and money to building these institutions and organization, probably we still have to show that there are some rules. And if we speak about the nuclear powers, of course, I do think that India and China and the others should be also interested to understand that there are some rules still in this world.
Yeah.
You know, you've written eloquently about this transformation of values that's taken place in Ukrainian society since the war, and you've said that Ukrainians have not only become more committed to the nation, but also more committed to liberal values, to the decentralization of power, and so on. But I wondered, do you think those values stand a chance of enduring in a post-war settlement, and what is to prevent Ukraine, given the Russian threat, from becoming a security state like Israel after the war?
If it's my concern, it is, but I think the time is not on our side. Currently, Ukraine is run by the moderate government, which is speaking about this multi-ethnic, moderate democracy with the liberal values at heart. So, of course, if the war prolongs for many years, we might have nationalistic Ukraine. So far, it's a paradox that for the last years, in all this climate in Europe, Ukraine is not a nationalistic country, despite all the kind of, what the Kremlin says. It's actually is strong because it's multicultural. It's strong because it has plurality of views. So I do think that is the time. The faster this victory is, the faster we're coming back to some normal, and the moderates remain on power, because now the war is fought by moderates. I'm, for instance, not afraid of the militarization of the Ukrainian society, because most of the people who are fighting, they are absolutely successful middle career people who want to be back to their IT companies, businesses. Just Liman, the city we talked today, you've been freed. One of the person who is fighting there is my very close colleague, who is this kind of king of Kiev hipsters, and like a person who can speak hours about coffee. Now he's, running the paratrooper division in Liman, and of course we want him to be back as soon as possible. So I do think this is I don't think that any war is usual, we shouldn't compare, but I do think that this moment should be appreciated, that it's quite unusual to have the war fought with the anti-militaristic society, and we shouldn't put the all-militaristic cliché on it at this moment.
Christopher, you had a striking comparison in one of your articles between the Ukrainians and the Kurds. You said that, like the Kurds, the Ukrainians have inhabited a bad neighborhood, and have vied unsuccessfully for a nation state. Is it your expectation, now granted you don't have a crystal ball, but is it your sense that, like the Kurds, the Ukrainians will end up being disappointed yet again by their benefactors and prevented from achieving their objective, the objective of national liberation, which Natalia has just laid out? Do you expect this to come to a peace that will be an unhappy one?
No, I don't. I don't think that they will be disappointed like the Kurds. They have their state. I think that their wars often end with disappointments on both sides, but no, I think they'll be like the Poles. I think that there'll be a country that was in a dangerous spot, lost its sovereignty for centuries, regained it briefly after World War II, and then got it back and becomes a stable state. I do think that. I don't think that there'll be. I mean, the Poles are one comparison, the Kurds are another, the Palestinians could be another one.
And if that's the case, is that not on some level a vindication of the strategy of supporting their struggle, or not?
No, it's a vindication of their claims to, I mean, they themselves must decide, how hard to fight for nationhood under those circumstances. And their strategy is theirs to do. I don't think it necessarily interacts with the question, with the question of whether it's in the American national interest. I mean, I think you're talking about attitudes in the United States and Europe. I think it's going to be far easier to win over Europe than it is the United States. Obviously, Europe is closer to Ukraine. But, you know, I looked at, there was a Pew poll. The Pew Center does very good polls, and they had one on the issues that are going to affect the 2022 election, and they had a graph with like 15 of them, and Ukraine wasn't one of them. And it's so Ukraine, the war wasn't one of them. So Ukraine is really electrifying people in the parts of the United States that you could call more culturally European. I mean, if you're in New York or Boston or San Francisco, I would say that the attitudes are very similar to the ones that you'd see in Vienna, say. But if I could compare American attitudes to Ukraine to something, it would be to German attitudes during the Iraq War, which is they're generally not really ready for a war, but it's mostly that they've got a lot of big problems on their plate, and that's a big factor in this, is the American domestic situation, which makes it very hard to pursue coherent policies on things outside of that.
It vice versa, you know, supporting the argument that, in fact, it definitely, the West, let's say in this classical term, didn't want to have into this war, that Vladimir Putin is absolutely wrong. The West didn't want it, and the US don't want it now. They want to get out, but of course we're saying that somehow it's impossible. The rules are broken already. You cannot pretend it didn't happen.
We have about 20 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Adam. NATALIYA GUMENYUK, thank you so much for your words. Christopher Caldwell. As a native New Yorker, I'm surprised to hear about New York as a European city in 2022, but I could be missing something in the 5 boroughs. I'm wondering, Christopher, your assertions strike me as almost identical to what the sort of recently departed Russian scholar Stephen Cohen, were he here, would say. Stephen Cohen is known traditionally, or was, as a sort of stalwart of the left. In some ways, a kind of ideological counterpart to yourself. But your views seem to be almost identical. Cohen would have added one thing. He would have added that Americans and Europeans need to understand Russia better. And I'm curious if you feel that that is something that you would also add, that if only we understood Russia better, we would have greater insight. NATALIYA GUMENYUK, if I can very quickly, and I can only thank you enough for and appreciate your courage and everything you're doing. Friedrich Merz, the CDU leader this week, as you read, made the rather outstanding, outrageous comment about Ukrainian welfare tourism that he then retracted. He's the leader of the opposition, the biggest party in Germany. He was speaking to something that is felt quite strongly. Adam asked you how in this oncoming winter you're going to be able to make the case, besides a moral case. How else does that need to be done substantively? Through what kind of advocacy, through what kind of engagement? Because it's going to require some pretty thoughtful, if you will, strategic communications. Thank you.
I may be not that sophisticated in strategic communication. Oh, sorry, because I wanted to pick the last point. But it's still a bit moral, I should say. I'm here in Vienna and anywhere in Berlin. And coming more from the left background, all these things about climate change and everything, I think that it's particularly in this circle, it's so normal to say that we would stand against the plastic tubes, against the fair trade, the coffee should be fair trade, the chocolate should be okay. We don't buy T-shirts from the ones done by, maybe sewed by the kids in Forest Asia. So I don't really get why there is a problem, why it's okay to buy the Russian gas, which is really, in the end, fund the tanks, the Grads, Iskanders, Uragan, and everything, which is like one, the transaction and then the escalation on the ground. It's maybe not very sophisticated argument, but I think if we're really living in this world when we're speaking about the moral consumption as a part of the pop culture, I do think that there is something wrong with the argument that we can't tolerate the gas, getting the oil resources from fossil fuels from Russia.
Yeah, I'm reminded a little bit of a speech that the FLN spokesman at the time in Africa, Frantz Fanon, made in Ghana to a group of African leaders, and he broke down crying and explained to a journalist afterward that he found it almost hallucinatory that he would have to explain to fellow Africans why they should support the Algerian struggle. And in a sense, I mean, that's the position that you find yourself in, trying to explain why Europeans should support the struggle, it seems to me.
My comparison of New York, Boston, and San Francisco to European cities was, I meant European-type cities. I meant, sort of like compact, highly urban cities with public transportation systems and literary scenes and places that culturally resemble Europe more than the great, suburban expanses of the country. It's funny you mentioned Stephen Cohen, who's a person whom I sort of like found myself paying more attention to in his last years, and even I would say admiring for his courage on a lot of matters. If I didn't add that we need to understand Russia better, it was an oversight. I am not a Russia specialist. I'm not like Stephen Cohen in that regard. But I would say yes, we definitely need to understand Russia, at least well enough that we can understand their rationales and their logic for things, and not just treat everything they do as being the product of a twisted sort of psychology,
Can I get into that? I also feel that there was something wrong about the Ukrainians being very sure that we understood Russians. And I think the president, the leadership, the citizens made a mistake. If we really speak about the Russian army, I think that the Ukrainians thought that, okay, it's probably the very same army, the same people. Maybe, they drink more, maybe they have more the better weapon and more equipped. But in the end, I think we missed 30 years of what was going on in Chechnya and in Syria. We really didn't understand why, because I talked to the generals, in particular asking the questions, why Ukrainians retreated from Mariupol, why they were not prepared, why they left some areas for occupation. And they said like, we thought that we would move to the positions we are able to attack, and then civilians, somehow they will manage. If there would be the danger, there would be human corridor, there would be we would bring some food, or we would evacuate the people. But they were appalled. They didn't expect that the soldiers would torture, would kill, would do everything they do, mainly because also Ukrainians didn't care for the last 30 years. They didn't care what the Russians were doing in Chechnya, and that there is this gruesome book of the atrocities. We're now working in the project with the Syrians, and we look, and with the people who also worked in Chechnya, and we see that it's not hazard, it's not chaotic, it's really the very same things the army does. This army, unfortunately, use the very same things they use. So I do think we also misunderstand, and the calls to, to get to the Russians, to get into the streets, which were very omnipresent for the first months of the war, Ukrainians hoped for that. So I do think, we need to admit we didn't understand the Russians as well.
And that Syria was a kind of laboratory. Christopher, though, I think Leonard Bernardo was underlining a rather strange irony in the sense that the conservative and conservative populist and intellectuals on the right have emerged in recent years, peculiarly, as some of the strongest Russophiles, while in the Cold War, the situation was quite reversed. Are you struck at all by that irony?
That's interesting. I think it has to do with this question that was a very important question in all, you know, during the Cold War, which was whether we were fighting a war against communism or a war against the latest incarnation of the Russian Empire. I think that the American right was really marked by anti-communism, and it tended to be. I think that there were a lot of the thing that Ivan Krastev was talking about in the last session about how you could hate communism and love Russians. I think it was more pronounced on the right in America than it was on the left. But there is something going on in the United States, certainly, in which left and right, if these words retain meaning, are converging on certain things. I think it might be that, for one, looked at kind of in terms of sociology of government, there is such a thing as a foreign policy establishment. There's a set of American sort of foreign policy doctrines that keep sort of keep getting renewed from administration to administration. And so they're quite naturally to be found in the center of American politics, and the people who are most skeptical about them are the ones who are least likely to be sort of like mainstream, you know, supporters of Democratic or Republican candidates. I think there's also the fact that certain people have been very chastened by the Iraq War of 20 years ago, and probably, you know, the further from sort of, let's say, political power you get, the more chastened you are by it. I don't know.
Okay. Other questions?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, NATALIYA GUMENYUK, for this wonderful interventions and your strong voice in favor of Ukraine. I'm still driven by the spirit of the lecture of Catherine Bolton from yesterday, so I only want to add ad votum that I do think that we really need those strong voices that would crush certain kind of skepticism, and we, as the West, we need to show that we are united and that we have grit and stamina, and that we are really interested and do not fool ourselves. We are also participating in this war, and I don't think that it's a bad thing to say that and admit openly. We are not just standing and looking. We would not like to do so. That's why I'm very skeptical about skepticism nowadays. I would think that this is something that strategic thinkers should do in their own closed rooms, but for the public, we should rather speak differently, especially when I saw the polls from Austria, where only 15% of the population is truly supporting the victory of the Ukraine. That would be my argument for this kind of environments that we have here, how we should speak and what arguments to use, that actually paying more for electricity this winter, it's not a personal tragedy, but it's your own investment in your own future. So I only wanted to add this to this discussion, split between support and certain kind of skepticism.
I think, of course, there are concerns. We in Vienna, there are concerns about glorification of the wars. They are legit. Absolutely. We have the history why we shouldn't glorify the wars. But I do think that we learned, especially within the last decades, to think that the only moral kind of allowed feeling regarding the war, there could be compassion. And Ukrainians don't need compassion. They want solidarity because they are fighting. And I might sound, of course, like naive Ukrainian, calming, emotional, wherever. But honestly, I'm super pragmatic. I don't want to be killed. I don't want to be tortured. I don't want my city invaded. I'm working now with 15 colleagues from all over the country. One has been detained for 8 years. Another was left her house. In another case, she left her flat and it's demolished. So I know what is defended. It's very practical for me. But I think for this to fight, you of course need to have a very clear vision. And of course, we need to suggest this vision. So for me, I also searching for more examples. I work with very gruesome things. I talk to the witnesses and the victims of the war crimes, of the people who really lived through the most horrible things. But of course, I need to find my inspiration somewhere. So where I search it, in the answer that I see that democracy is, because I was thinking, what the vision Ukraine can do to the world, what the vision it can give to me, to my city, to my society. And it's interesting that the vision is that democracy is in the end more efficient. Because for the last 30 years, especially 20 years, and especially since Putin is in power, and there are all these people around the globe, they were trying to impose this idea that the democracy is chaotic, is unmanageable. So let's get back to the rule of thumb by the, like this one dictator. Because if I see that Ukraine can defend itself because it's decentralized. The army can fight because it can take decisions on the ground level. The cities are managed to work because there would be different parties, and if the governor is not okay, the mayor would be okay, and if one party isn't running well in one region, then an opposition kind of politicians or anti-corruption activists would get into that and they do the things together. So I do think that I'm quite fascinated by this idea. I really didn't understand that democracy on the ground, it's exactly working and literally working. Because in Kharkiv city, the mayor of one political party and the governor from another political party should sit together and understand, should they put the subway working, or should it be the bunker and the basement for the people, hiding from the shelling? And they need to sit together and take this decision together because it's too responsible, and they see that this cooperation works. Also for the Ukrainians who were always dismissing of their state and returning to the argument about the Kurds, Ukrainians were always, with the reason, maybe partially as Americans, they have this skepticism to the state, to the power. They feel that the state could be okay, that actually the state is somebody who defends them. It could be something else apart from the oppressor. So of course I think that in this regard, for me, it's very interesting to pass this idea to other countries which are not democratic, that in the end, democracy in the long run is efficient. And that's, despite all the horrors of the war, I think like, okay, let it be this model. You can embrace it, you cannot, but at least I suggest it.
We have time for another question.
Okay. Well, question for Mr. Caldwell. When you suggest that support in the United States for the Ukraine policy is kind of limited to those Europeanized elites, it would suggest that there must be widespread skepticism or even opposition to spending billions and billions, what the US is doing now to support Ukraine, both financially and militarily. Now, we hear this on Fox News by Tucker Carlson, but otherwise, there is no sign of it in Congress, there's no sign of it in opinion polls, in the campaign now for the midterm. Are we all missing something here, kind of a groundswell that will come up, or are you perhaps underestimating the willingness of the average American people to stand up against aggression and for the rule-based system which the US built up after World War II?
That's why I tried to draw the comparison to Germany during the Iraq War. Because no, I don't think there is opposition to this war. What I think there is indifference to it. Although there is opposition to certain things around the war, like deficit spending, and people are now very worried about about inflation. And the United States expenditures on the Russo-Ukrainian war are pretty extraordinary. However, I think that the tight money policy of the Federal Reserve probably gives the administration a little bit of leeway now for the money it has spent without too much fear of inflation. But it's very hard to tell right now, because I think that up until recently, the Republicans, which is probably where opposition would come from, the Republicans have believed that they are at a great advantage in the coming elections and might be reluctant to alter the equation by introducing a new issue into it. So, but to be clear, I don't think that there's a concentrated opposition, more of an indifference.
I want to thank our panelists for joining us. Natalia, Christopher, it was wonderful to speak to you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. That was okay.